Hey, I'm Bill Houghton, and I am the founder of the Sensible Surrogacy Agency. And today we are talking about surrogacy in Mexico, what's likely to be the next international surrogacy hub. So if you've been following the blog for a while, you probably know that I have spent the last several years telling people that surrogacy in Mexico was unregulated, and unregulated surrogacy comes with a host of risks. But that changed completely in 2021 with a decision by the Mexican Supreme Court. And essentially what the court did was open up the possibility for commercial surrogacy for all individuals across Mexico. So for a moment, let's go back and take a look at the Supreme Court decision and what that means. First of all, a little bit of context. Like the United States, surrogacy in Mexico is regulated on a state-by-state basis, and each state gets to decide how they want to treat surrogacy and how they want to regulate it. Now, before 2016, there was one state in Mexico that was what we would call surrogacy friendly. And by that, I mean that they had actual legislation that legalized surrogacy for individuals in that state. And that was the state of Tabasco. But in 2016, Tabasco did a 180-degree turn and essentially banned surrogacy completely. And with that, surrogacy became either illegal in Mexico or unregulated in all the other states where there was no surrogacy legislation whatsoever. Now, unregulated surrogacy is risky for a number of reasons, but primarily because without any specific regulation, then it really falls to the local authorities in charge at the moment to decide if surrogacy is going to be legal that day or not. Unregulated surrogacy also leaves the full parental power to the surrogate. And so I told couples that this was a dangerous, risky proposition and that they should pull out of Mexico, just like I advised them to pull out of other unregulated destinations, and there are quite a few worldwide. But that prohibition in the state of Tabasco worked its way up to the Mexican Supreme Court. And in 2021, the court ruled that Tabasco could not ban surrogacy. The court overturned that prohibition, and they essentially made three rulings that are really notable if you're interested in surrogacy in Mexico. The first is that the Supreme Court recognized that it is an inherent human right to form a family, and that assisted reproduction was a recognized means of pursuing that basic right. Surrogacy in particular was an accepted means of having a child, of pursuing a basic right of forming a family. So under the Constitution of Mexico, all individuals need to have equal access to surrogacy, whether they are married, single, gay, straight, foreign, or domestic. So what the Supreme Court eventually said was that surrogacy cannot be banned. It has to be allowed and it has to be available universally. And so with that ruling, the Supreme Court legalized surrogacy across the board. They overturned the Tabasco prohibition and mandated that all states across Mexico provide some sort of access to gestational surrogacy. And in addition, they included commercial surrogacy specifically in that ruling. So not only was surrogacy protected, but commercial surrogacy and the existence of agencies and agents who assisted couples in pursuing their right to have a family. All of those commercial activities were in fact protected as well. The second notable Supreme Court ruling was that it was up to the individual states to regulate surrogacy. And while the states could not ban surrogacy completely, they still had the obligation to regulate the practice and to decide how they were going to make surrogacy accessible and secure to everyone. And so what we see now is that while surrogacy is technically legal across Mexico, it varies from state to state as to exactly how surrogacy works. In some states, there are some states that are very surrogacy friendly. And the process is very straightforward and very supportive of the intended parents. In other states, the regulations are strict and can be very onerous. But in most states right now, given that the Supreme Court was relatively recent, most states in Mexico haven't yet fully figured out how they're going to regulate surrogacy. And so we're going to see how that shapes out over the course of the coming years. The third thing that the Supreme Court said, which is very notable, is that in cases where the parentage of a child is at question, the legal parents are not decided by genetics or biology at all. In fact, the court acknowledged a concept known as procreational will. Now, procreational will refers to the actual intent to form a family. Procreational will belongs to the individuals who are attempting to form a family, attempting, to have a baby. And under the Supreme Court ruling, they are in fact the legal parents. So in Mexico, if there's a formal agreement at the start of an assisted reproduction process, including surrogacy, it is the individuals commissioning the procedure who clearly have procreational will, and not the surrogate who clearly states that she has no intention of being a parent, right? Her intention is just to support the procreational will of the IPs. And so that puts Mexico on a very short list of countries now where if you have a valid surrogacy agreement, then the intended parents would be recognized as the legal parents when the baby is born. The surrogate is not considered a parent under Mexican law. Now, it's important to note that the Supreme Court did not rule that if there is a surrogacy agreement, that the birth certificate should be issued with the names of the intended parents. What the Supreme Court ruled was that if there is a question of the parentage of a child, that question is determined by procreational will. And so the Supreme Court essentially said that any lower court in Mexico, when presented with a valid surrogacy contract, needs to rule in favor of the intended parents, right? That they are, in fact, the legal parents. And then it would be up to the local court to decide how to recognize that situation. In a very progressive state, the court could declare that the birth certificate should be issued to show the intended parents as the legal parents. And this is essentially what happens in the U.S. state of California and in what's called a pre-birth parentage order or a pre-birth order. Or in some states in the U.S. where they have post-birth orders, right? And so in Mexico now, there's a legal framework that's quite similar to the state of California, and that is huge. I like to tell all of my clients that there's no perfect destination for surrogacy. Every destination has its unique benefits and drawbacks. And so when you're weighing the international options, you have to look at each destination in terms of its positives and its negatives, right? Its advantages and its disadvantages. And then you make a decision based on which of those benefits are really meaningful for you, and which of the disadvantages do you consider to be frivolous or unimportant. And with that in mind, let's take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of Mexico for surrogacy. The first advantage of Mexico is clearly the legal framework. Under the current legal framework in Mexico, the surrogate is not considered to be a legal parent, and with a properly executed surrogacy contract and the issuance of a pre-birth order, the intended parents would be named as the legal parents on the birth certificate when the baby's born. And that means that when you get home to wherever it is you're taking the baby, that there's no need for a step-parent adoption process or a second-parent adoption or a parental order or whatever other legal process you would normally take to ensure that both of the intended parents are in fact the legal parents and that the surrogate has no parental rights. And that is a huge, huge benefit. The second benefit of Mexico for surrogacy is that, it's rather convenient, especially if you're coming from North America or from Europe. Mexico City is a much easier destination to reach than other surrogacy hubs like, say, Cyprus or Georgia or Colombia. For most travelers in the region, there is no visa required other than a simple tourist visa to enter Mexico. And the cost of living in Mexico is relatively low, so it's an easy place to stay for a few weeks once the baby's born and you're working on citizenship and passports. The cost of surrogacy in Mexico is also a huge benefit. A surrogacy program in Mexico is going to be about half of what you would pay for the same procedures in the United States. And we'll talk more about the cost of Mexico in a minute, but there are commercial programs for surrogacy that include guarantee programs, multiple transfer packages. In general, clinics in Mexico are very amenable to working with intended parents to find an appropriate program to meet their financial needs. Also, because surrogacy in Mexico is relatively new, most agencies don't have an enormous backlog of clients. So you can be matched with a surrogate in Mexico probably in just a matter of weeks. Compare that to other destinations like the US or Canada, where surrogate matching can take months or even years, depending on your personal situation. Clinics in Mexico are generally quite advanced, and the medical care system in Mexico is well respected worldwide. Mexico is ranked quite highly by the WHO in terms of the quality of its medical care. So it's generally one of the more popular destinations for Americans to travel for medical procedures. Medical tourism is a popular option for Americans that face high medical expenses at home. And Mexico is a very popular destination in North America. And so it's quite well established as a destination for medical treatments. And now, you can add gestational surrogacy to that list of medical treatments that are available in Mexico. And so those are the advantages of surrogacy in Mexico. But there are some notable challenges that you should know about before you make a decision to start a program. The greatest challenge of surrogacy in Mexico, like the United States, is that Mexico has no national health care service, or at least no universal national health care. Healthcare in Mexico is privatized in the same way it is in the United States, which means that your surrogate is going to need to have a health insurance policy provided for her. And this creates a little bit of complication because you definitely need to have health insurance for both your surrogate and for the baby. If the baby arrives prematurely or there are complications during the delivery, it's not inconceivable that the baby will end up in an incubator for some time or in a neonatal intensive care unit or some other medical treatment. And right now, it's early in 2023, a neonatal intensive care unit in Mexico runs for about $2,000 a day. So if the baby is born early and you need to have a couple weeks of medical care, well, then clearly we're talking about a lot of money. So your surrogate needs health care, and it comes to the intended parents or her agency to provide that, which is an additional expense. So you should check with your agency to make sure that the surrogate is going to be provided health insurance and that the cost of the health insurance is being included in her budget. Also check that the terms of the health insurance policy and whether or not there are deductibles and copayments. Now, under laws in Mexico, it's also not possible for the baby to be covered under the surrogate's health insurance. So separate arrangements need to be made for the baby's medical care. And in case it were needed, you should definitely talk to your agency in advance of that. Now, Americans traveling to Mexico will be familiar with some travel advisories that are put out by the US State Department, and those advise that there are regions in Mexico that you should avoid. And this is true. There are areas of Mexico that I would not want to travel to, that are dangerous and have significant crime rates. So like many countries, if you feel like being adventurous and exploring the countryside, you should be mindful of where you go. Always heed the advice of authorities and stay within tourist-friendly areas. But don't let the general concern about Mexico deter you from visiting some of the very beautiful areas in the country. Mexico is a very popular international tourist destination, and it's the #1 tourism spot for Americans. Most areas in Mexico are actually very welcoming and very secure, and where you can feel as safe as you would in any major US city. Now that said, you should check on the destination of your surrogacy procedure and where your clinic will be and where your surrogate will live to make sure that she's living in an area which is relatively safe. As with any service procedure that's performed internationally, when the baby is born, you'll need to apply for citizenship and a passport in order for the baby to return home with you. This is true whether you are having a surrogacy program in Mexico or Canada, or any destination where the baby needs to travel internationally to return home. Now, the process of applying for citizenship varies from country to country, but it's likely going to take several weeks. And for the United States, the process of establishing the baby's U.S. citizenship and getting a U.S. passport generally takes about 3 to 3.5 weeks. But you should always check with your local consulate before you decide on the destination as to how long it will take for you to get the baby's citizenship and get a passport to return home. And that'll help you decide how much time to allow after the baby is born that you're going to have to stay overseas. Now, about half of my clients, especially those from the US, start a program in Mexico using embryos that they have conceived in an IVF cycle back home, which is great. But Mexico has a very strict permit requirement for the import of human embryos and gametes. The permit application process to bring your embryos into Mexico can take a while. It's officially going to take 45 to 60 working days, according to the authorities in Mexico at the moment. But in reality, it can be much longer, possibly a year or more. And what we have found in our experience there is that there's really no way to know exactly how long it's going to take or where you are in the process once it's begun. And the process can also be rather expensive. The permits themselves cost about $1,500 US, and the cost of shipping is going to be another $4,000 or more. So if you're thinking about bringing your embryos into Mexico for a serious surrogacy procedure, you should plan on adding an additional 4 to 5 months to the duration of your surrogacy journey, while the appropriate permits are processed, plus an additional $5,000 to $6,000 in the cost of your budget. Surrogacy programs in Mexico are available to hetero, LGBT, and single individuals. Right? The cost of surrogacy in Mexico ranges from $55,000 to $65,000. And some surrogacy agencies will include guarantee programs that offer unlimited clinical procedures, IVF cycles, embryo transfers, for a fixed cost. And those are generally going to run around $70,000 to $75,000. In general, surrogacy programs in Mexico are what we would call fixed cost programs. And that means that the budget is clearly defined and fixed before you begin the program. Now, you'd pay the total amount of the budget to your local operator, and then he would disperse the money to the surrogate, to the clinic, to the lawyers, etc. Fixed cost programs are popular at international destinations because it's a real challenge for intended parents who don't live in that country to find all of the appropriate resources, right? To locate a reputable clinic, to find a good surrogacy lawyer, to find the best way to compensate their surrogate according to the local laws. And so in a country like Mexico, those funds would be paid to your agent, and part of the agent's responsibilities would be to make sure that all of the service providers in the program are paid according to the local regulations. If you bring your existing embryos, surrogacy costs are going to be lower, but plan to spend an additional, like I said, $6,000 for transporting your embryos into Mexico. As always, you should consider price as a factor in your decision to do surrogacy in Mexico, and in your decision on which agency in Mexico to use. And prices are going to vary between agencies and between clinics. But not all agencies' pricing is completely transparent. And the best strategy for choosing an appropriate agency in Mexico is to get a detailed list of the services provided and a line item budget that shows exactly what's going to be included in the cost of your surrogacy program. And what you want is to compare apples to apples, and so that you know that there are no additional expenses that you're going to incur later on. For example, is the cost of the surrogate's health insurance included in the budget? Are there additional expenses to help you with the import of your embryos? Will you need a local egg donor for your program? Will her compensation be an additional fee? The only way to know that is to look at the budget side by side in as much detail as possible and compare what are the services provided by each agency. Finally, as you decide which agency to use, the most important criteria is going to be how comfortable you are working with them. It's important that you talk to the agent who you're going to be working with or the local team that will be handling your journey. You want to get to know them and decide whether or not you're comfortable working with them on such a profoundly intimate process. And with that, I would invite you to send a message to us here at Sensible to find out more about our own surrogacy program in Mexico. And you can visit our website at sensiblesurrogacy.com. And there's a wealth of information about surrogacy in Mexico and about surrogacy procedures in general, how they work, what are the risks and what are the opportunities, both in the United States and worldwide. And you can fill out a quick form, and one of our team will be able to talk with you directly and will guide you through the program to help you weigh the options of your journey. Or you can send us a note, send me a note at bill@sensiblesurrogacy.com, and I'll be happy to schedule a time to talk with you and answer your questions. And I hope this video has been clear and helpful. We'll be making more videos like this on a variety of subjects, so look for those. And I look forward to seeing you in one of those.